What is up, guys? I am the Six Machine and welcome back to another Warhammer video. So first off, apologies for the lack of videos the last couple of days. I know I said I was going to cover each of the 5 Death Guard articles this week in turn, but unfortunately A, work got in the way, and B, to be honest, the article on Wednesday was kind of short, so I really didn't think it was worth doing a whole video about by itself. So what I decided today is that I would do the last 3 articles, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, in this one video, and we can have a chat about all those changes here. So let's just get right into it and start with Wednesday's article, which covered the new rule Remorseless. This one is very short, sweet, and to be honest, again, as I said, kind of meh. Each time you take a combat attrition test for this unit, you ignore any and all modifiers. It basically means that if you fail your morale and you have to do an attrition test for every model in the unit, you only ever lose the models on the roll of a 1. Normally, if you don't know already, if a unit is half strength, you lose models or a 1 or a 2, and there's also various sort of spells and in-game effects that can change that as well. But for the Death Guard, they ignore all that. You only ever lose extra models on rolls of 1s. So, I mean, yes, I can see the appeal for that for units which are obviously going to be rather expensive. Toughness 5, 2 wounds infantry isn't going to be coming in cheap, I don't think. But for me, it just seems like a bit of a boring rule, you know? Morale definitely can be a factor in games of 9th edition, and although it's certainly become more of a phase that you can't just flat out ignore anymore, chances are that with your Death Guard, between pretty good leadership and relatively small squad sizes that you're going to have, this isn't going to be a rule that is going to be a deciding factor for players as to whether they're going to play the Death Guard or not. Although technically it fits as being one of the Games Workshop's 5 key changes to Death Guards, I feel like it's kind of pulling the wool over our eyes in calling this an actual kind of like big key change to them. It is obviously something new and something different to them, but it's pretty non-factorish, really, I think. To be honest, there isn't really much else to say about this one. The article isn't particularly long. It basically just shows you the remorseless rule, which you can see on the screen now, and just reminds you that, with your toughness 5, multiple wounds, Marines, it's going to be very hard to take these models off the table if they're in cover holding an objective. And that is true, it will make you kind of stick around a little bit longer, but I just think it's a bit of a boring rule. It's not really worth an article's worth of writing or video. Now, the second change that we're covering today, which was from Thursday's article, oh boy, this one kicked it up a notch. This one certainly stirred the pot a little bit. This is the changes to Disgustingly Resilient. So previously being the rather infamous 5 up to ignore wounds, both normal and mortal wounds, which was, as GW state in the article, pretty much synonymous with the Death Guard, and added that further layer of survivability to your Toughness 5 models. This has been completely reworked, and as you can see on the screen now, it now means that for every attack allocated to your model or unit with this ability, that attack has its damage characteristic reduced by 1 to a minimum of 1. Which is, wow. I mean, when I first saw that, I was like, that's really powerful. Knowing that Plague Marines are going up to 2 wounds and Terminators are going up to 3 wounds, that seems really, really strong. And, first things first, against things like overcharged plasma, autocannons, heavy bolters, all those other 2-wound weapons that are very prevalent in the meta right now, this definitely is a good change. It means that you are 100% guaranteed to survive a wounding hit against those guns, whereas before, if you had the previous Disgustingly Resilient, you'd have to have made at least one 5-up save to make sure that your model survived it. So from that perspective, so far so good. But, and I will clarify here, I haven't done the maths. I'm sure there are plenty of people on YouTube or articles out there that have, so if you want to go and look at the actual kind of inner details and intricate mathematics of working out what's better, you can go find that. But for me, in terms of how I feel about this, I think apart from the niche scenario where you're against 2 damage weapons, it's at best a side grade for most of a lot of your sort of heavier vehicles and characters, like Mortarion, Plague Burst Crawlers, because the way I see it is that if you take 6 damage from a las cannon, new version, you're taking it down to 5. Fine, that's easy to understand. But if you had the old version, you would have 6 chances to make those 5-up disgustingly resilient saves. And on average, you're going to make 2 of them. So you would be dropping it down to 4 damage. And I mean, yes, you can argue that the dice won't always be on your side, and this new version is a bit more sort of like stable and reliable. But for me, it just seems like the potential to save more with the older version, and the fact that you get to roll dice, which is for me something I enjoy doing. Like, I love rolling dice. So for me, that definitely outweighs the kind of the stability and the knowledge that it's always going to be reduced by 1 that the new version brings you. Some people, I'm sure, will prefer that, because then they can kind of factor in what the average is going to be on sort of like a d6 damage shot, which is average, 3.5 damage, I believe, and other sort of like 3 damage weapon, which is quite prevalent against vehicles and stuff as well. So you can kind of plan ahead to know that those sort of weapons are going to be doing just 1 less, and you don't have to rely on your disgustingly resilient rolls. But for me, I preferred the rolling aspect. I think it's more fun and adds a bit more variety and randomness to the game, which I'm always keen on. And I get it. This may well be a way to speed up the amount of dice rolling needed. With ignoring wounds, you're going through a hit roll, a wound roll, a save roll, and then another essentially save roll with the old disgustingly resilient. But I mean, Iron Hands still have the ignore wounds, as do plenty of other armies and units, so that doesn't really fly with me. I did see a few people kind of say that as a possible suggestion, as Games Workshop just trying to cut down on the amount of sort of gates and barriers that you need to get through before you remove a model. But there's so many things that still have that I don't think that is the case. And I mean, look, here's the big thing for me personally. The old disgustingly resilient felt more Nurgly to me. In my mind, it was like the bullets and everything were, hitting your units and thudding into their bodies and wounding them, but their resilience just enabled them to keep on marching forward and like ignoring it. This -1 to the damage gives for me like more of a feeling as like some weird force field that prevents the full impact of the weapon hitting the units. You know what I mean? Like, it seems, this new version seems more pre-impact, whereas the older version felt more post-impact, which was kind of, shown by the roll. I don't know if that makes sense, but in my head, like, there's a definite like distinction between how the two, like, the -1 damage seems to occur on the weapon side before it fires, and the 5-up to ignore wounds is like on your side with your models. I know that doesn't quite make sense, but in my head there's a definite distinction between the two, and I prefer the old 5-up to ignore wounds. And the other issue that I have with this rule is that, again, for me, you may disagree, but for me, Death Guard are meant to be like really super survivable against light arms fire, las guns, bolters, and that sort of thing. I have no issue with a missile launcher blowing a Plague Marine to pieces, but las guns in my mind should, thud into their chest and look like they've done nothing at all most of the time. And this rule makes them better against heavier weapons and worse against things that they were survivable against before. Things like bolters and lasguns that are just 1 damage. This new disgustingly resilient does absolutely nothing to make them more resilient against them, and that seems very counter to what Death Guard should be to me. And before anyone cries out, I know that overall they have got more survivable against all weapons because they've obviously got the second wound. But I mean, that's not like a Plague Marine or a Death Guard thing. That's just a generic Marine thing. All Marines are getting 2 wounds, so all Marines are more resilient to lasguns and bolters. But you would think that Death Guard and Plague Marines would be even more resilient still to like that kind of light arms fire. I don't know. I mean, I think this rule is certainly powerful in some situations, and I can see it making the 3-wound Terminators an absolute nightmare to put down, especially in cover. But again, just spam those 1 damage weapons at them, and they're not going to be much more difficult to kill than they were before. Like, yes, you have to get through 3 wounds instead of 2, but they don't have that 5-up to ignore wounds. So yeah, I think, like, doing some very quick maths in my head, they're going to be slightly more survivable, but it's not going to be like a huge difference. I really wouldn't mind them being 3 wounds with the old disgustingly resilient and make them like, you know, really tough. I think the thing that I'm most disappointed with is that this, as I said, this disgustingly resilient rule feels less fluffy to me. And up till now, the rules for the Death Guard that we've seen, as I've said in my previous videos, have all felt really cool and fun and fluffy for the Death Guard. And this one it just doesn't sit right with me in terms of how it's portraying the Death Guard. It doesn't, in my mind, it's not how disgustingly resilient would work for them. But that's just me. I'm a tad disappointed with this change. You know, obviously, Plague Marines and Terminators are going to be getting a points bump because of the extra wound they're getting, but I would rather have kept the 5 up to ignore wounds on top of that and maybe had a slightly bigger points increase than they're going to be getting. So yeah, some situations, namely against 2 damage weapons, better, and 3 damage weapons for the Terminators. You know, I definitely, it is an improvement, but against 1 damage weapons, and I think for a lot of the vehicles and characters and against heavier stuff, as I said, it's arguably a side grade at best, and in some cases it's flat out worse. So yeah, that's just what I think about Disgustingly Resilient. I love it as a rule, like the idea of it making the Plague Marines much tougher and stronger, but I just don't think it works for me. This new version, it doesn't quite hit the spot like the old one did. But anyway, last up we have the final key new rule for the Death Guard that Games Workshop are showing us, and that is the Contagions of Nurgle rule. And if you saw my Mortarion video, we've seen that before. It's on Mortarion's datasheet, but obviously we didn't know what it did. Well, now we do, and I have to say, it looks pretty damn cool. As you can see on the screen, there is a table, and if your entire army has the Death Guard keyword, it gains Nurgle's gift. And you consult the chart, which you could also see on the screen, and anything in that range gets a -1 to its toughness. Now you may remember that I was a bit sad about Mortarion losing the ability to inflict -1 toughness on enemies with his old toxic presence, and it looks like he's back. So that's good, albeit with a new name, and the old rule had a 7-inch aura, so technically this new version is worse until turn 4, but then it does get better going up to a 9-inch range. And now, -1 toughness on enemy units in an aura is a really good rule. It's a really great rule. It's a really big deal for dropping things to being wounded on, you know, 3s or 2s, or, you know, dropping things that you would be wounding on 6s to 5s. It's a huge bonus. It's essentially, in many cases, getting like +1 to wound. And it doesn't look as though it's only Mortarion getting this. The article states that some of the faster units, like the Blight Haulers and the Bloat Drones, will be a great way to bring this debuff right into the heart of the enemy forces. And as it straight up lowers toughness, this is going to make all of your shooting better as well. It's not like it affects just melee or anything like that. Your whole army, if you get something up into your enemy lines and get this aura off, your whole army is essentially going to be getting a +1 to wound against a lot of targets under this debuff. And what makes this even tastier is that new terrain piece that we saw the other week, the Miasmic Malignifier. Terrible name, but whatever. The chimney thing. That counts as always being in turn 4 for the rule, and it can be set up 12 inches from your enemy deployment zone when you deploy. So that's a hugely handy way to create a no-go zone for enemy forces, or if you put it somewhere where they can't get around it, it's a really huge way to debuff a lot of the enemy's really important units. You know, Knights going down to T7, Marines at toughness 3, Guardsmen going to toughness 2. That's going to make a huge difference when you unleash your firepower against them. And another thing that's been noticed about this rule is that the ability Nurgle's Gift comes under the Contagions of Nurgle umbrella rule name, and you may notice that says Contagions, plural. And as you can see, the rule states that contagion abilities affect enemies in a range. So is Nurgle's Gift just one that we can potentially choose from, or that various units may have access to? I'm kind of wondering if we may see some other ones. Obviously, they all have this growing aura range as like the key component that links them all, but the effects may be very different. If I was going to guess, I would say maybe there's one that gives a -1 to hit 2 units sort of in an aura, or one that doles out mortal wounds, or maybe one that just straight up kind of regens wounds in your command phase. Who knows? But certainly this is a very fluffy, very cool, and potentially very, very powerful ability that it seems like a fair chunk of the Death Guard models and vehicles and units are going to get. So ending on a high, like, this is a really cool ability. I like it a lot. I'm hoping that there are a lot of choices for the kind of contagion abilities you can choose, and they really kind of change your playstyle and dictate how you play. That's what I'm hoping for. But that is it for the Death Guard abilities. We've had 5 days of previews for the Death Guard from GW, and I think overall they're pretty good and pretty fluffy. There are a few shaky ones, and I mean, none of them obviously are like totally game breaking or extremely powerful in their own right, I don't think. But certainly, if we look at all 5 of them together, the possibilities by having an army which has all 5 of these abilities does lead to some potentially nasty combinations. And I think the Death Guard players have got a lot to look forward to in sort of, having characters moving up, buffing themselves and the units around them with not only the Deadly Pathogens ability, but their Contagions of Nurgle, whilst, all the units are moving, never stopping with their inexorable advance, just raining down firepower on the enemy as they move up, who may well be at -1 toughness as well. And then when you're holding objectives, if you're in cover, your Plague Marines are still going to be toughness 5, 2 wounds with a 2-up save. So they're still going to be really tough to shift, and anything that's got less than 3 damage firepower is going to really struggle to take them out. Even though, saltiness aside, they would be even harder to take out if they had the old Disgustingly Resilient against some firepower. But still, they're going to be very, very nasty to shift. I mean, are Death Guard going to break the meta? Obviously, this all depends on the points, but just looking at the rules that are going to be getting, I don't think so. I think we can expect to see some moderate points increase amongst the infantry, but I think many of the vehicles will stay roughly the same as they are now, or perhaps even get a little bit cheaper due to the changes to Disgustingly Resilient, which I think make them slightly less survivable. So I think a few vehicles may go down, and some of the infantry, certainly Terminators and Plague Marines and such, will go up. But in general, I think the Death Guard look to be very fun to play if you want an army that is kind of elite and smallish and is just mega, mega tough to kill, and that just has that whole playstyle of like this unstoppable force that relentlessly marches and bears down on the enemy lines, and just won't die even as your opponent fires every single bullet they have into you. And for me, that sounds pretty cool. Like, that sounds like a very cool playstyle, just like this, not a horde, but just like this elite force that you just cannot put down, and then they reach your lines and they just debuff you and plague you and bring all these horrible abilities that cause your army to become worse, and you lose toughness, maybe strength, or that kind of thing as well, and you just get overwhelmed by this kind of aura of death and decay. That's cool. I like that. I like the idea of that, and I think these rules will certainly help you do that, even if it doesn't make them the most powerful army on the tabletop. So anyway, let me know what you think of the Death Guard rules that we've been shown, and how do you think they are going to perform when the Codex finally does drop. Let me know what you're excited about, what you're disappointed about, and I'd love to know what you think about the Disgustingly Resilient rule, for example, whether you think it's better or whether you think it's worse. Let me know in the comments below, and please, as always, like and subscribe for more videos from me. Until next time though, I'll catch you later, guys.